I used to think a house was only a shelter. For me, it was a place that learned how to wait until I was asleep. I was 8 when we moved into that old two-story on Hemlock Street, a narrow house with sagging porches and a cellar that smelled like cold metal and old apples. During the day, it looked like any other house on a block, where kids left bikes in driveways and lawns had sprinkler arcs that glittered in summer. There were neighborhood barbecues and the sound of a lawnmower on Saturdays. At night, the whole world shrank to the walls of my bedroom and a darkness that felt deliberate. I will say straight away that I was the kind of kid who liked logic games and small experiments. I read science books with the same hunger other boys had for cartoons. That does not mean I will bend what I remember to fit a superstition. I am telling you what happened as best I can, and you can decide which part of me is remembering wrong and which part is telling you the truth. I will tell this in the order it happened, night after night, and by the end you will know why I stopped seeing my childhood home as a place to return to. Listen for the sound that keeps coming back in my memory like a needle on a record, the quiet scraping, the breath close to my ear. The first time I woke from the scraping, I thought it was the cat. We had a thin gray cat named Binks who made a habit of claiming laps and spilling across warm laundry. It was 2 in the morning. I remember the clock on my dresser with its square red digits, the way the numbers leaked light across the ceiling. My room was the one at the back of the house, a long, narrow space with a window that faced the backyard, and a freestanding wardrobe with a mirror that always seemed a size too tall for the space. I remember my 8-year-old hands clutching the covers because the bed smelled like cedar and old detergent, like the sheets had been ironed by someone who believed in rules. The scraping started at the foot of the bed, a sound like soft nails on wood, and then a smear across the floor as if something had been dragged. I pretended I was brave. I rolled over and said aloud to the dark, "Binks, stop." And the house gave me an answer that sounded like a whisper, but not a voice any animal had. It threaded the word into the fabric of the room. I listened. The whisper was close to my ear, and the breath that accompanied it tasted like cold metal. I felt a pressure along my spine, a pressure that was patient and careful in the way a hand warms a place before it touches. I will never forget the
smell it, left in the air like pennies and old paper. My mother Sarah came in with a nightlight and the soft chirp of a guilty parent who thinks leaving a child alone is an acceptable risk. She switched on the lamp and said, "It is only the wind, honey." And I nodded, because you nod when adults give you answers. But even then I knew the wind did not sound like that. My father Mark laughed when I told him at breakfast. "Old houses have noises," he said, handing me a piece of toast. That was the first pattern that emerged the day life kept its edges and the night took them away. The daytime version of the house was ordinary and warm. The nighttime version was confident and intent. I learned very early to measure my safety by the amount of light around me and the number of doors I could see closed. The second night, the sound came again, and this time I felt something under the sheets. I woke with my chest tight, a knot in my throat that tasted like copper, and thought my cat had curled into the hollow by my knees. My hand touched cold skin, not fur, a hand that did not belong to me. I jerked, and the hand was gone, and the covers were still. I thought maybe it was a dream, until I found a faint wetness on the fabric, and under the mattress a thin smear, as if someone had dragged something sharp. I called for my sister Lucy, and she came in, rubbing her eyes. "Stop making up things," she muttered, but when she sat on the bed she flinched at the air in the room. Her cheeks were cold. The first night my parents dismissed it. The second night they began to worry in private, and began to argue about fans and pipes and the foundation. They called Mr. Harlan next door to look at the rafters, and our landlord, Mrs. Green, said she would send someone to check for mice. The adults had procedures, a handyman with a toolbox, a plumber with a flashlight, a rat trap under the porch. Those inspections felt clinical and routine, but they were conducted as if a house was simply a system in need of repair. The things they found were small cracks, a loose board near the back door, the usual settling noises of an old house. They did not explain the cold on the bedsheet or the way the night folded itself around me like a waiting mouth. The pattern settled into a rhythm. Days were school, cartoons, and friends like Tom who lived 2 doors down and traded his comic books for my baseball cards. Nights were a different geography. The sounds began to get smaller and more confident. I would be drifting off, and then the bed would sigh, as if someone had shifted weight beside me. I would smell something like the inside
Of an old briefcase leather and dust, and then a scent of citrus, like a peeled orange, which felt absurd because we never ate oranges at midnight. I developed rituals because rituals made the world tolerable. I placed my favorite toy soldier under my pillow. I kept a glass of water on the nightstand. I called out the name of an imaginary protector, and I left the closet door open at a precise 30-degree angle, because that made the shadow fall in a way I could watch. I learned to count the ticks of the heater and to place a Bible under the mattress, because my mother insisted. The rituals made me feel like I was participating in a negotiation, and that if I performed them properly, the house would abide. I was small, but I was not mute about fear. I told teachers, I wrote in notebooks, I drew pictures with jagged lines to represent the scraping. "You have a vivid imagination," was the kind assessment most adults offered. But the more I spoke, the more the adults brought in other voices to translate my fear into something medical and manageable. We saw a perinatal consultant, a clinical professional who explained parasomnias and night terrors in a way that felt like a map. "Children that age can experience content that seems real," he said. Dr. Patel had a calm voice and smelled faintly of lemon oil. She recommended we keep a sleep diary and suggested a referral for a simple sleep study if things got worse. The first time I was wired for a sleep study, they attached sensors to my scalp and my limbs and told me to go to sleep like a scientific subject. The procedure was intimate and cynical at once, a machine listening to the body for patterns that could be read and used. I remember the hum of the monitor and the sensation of being transparent. They called it polysomnography and explained stages of sleep, REM cycles, slow wave activity, and jagged spikes that might indicate parasomnia. I was young enough to accept the electrodes as a kind of costume, and old enough to know the world had people who could write in charts. The exam showed odd movements, but nothing conclusive. It gave the adults comfort they could carry like a talisman. It did not comment on the things that breathed near my hair or the pressure that pushed gently on my collarbone. By the time I was 10, the episodes had grown into a pattern, the house hungry at night and patient in its cruelty. I learned how to be quiet in case sound invited proximity. I learned how to scare myself into staying alert. I would whisper to myself the facts I trusted, counting the number of windows in my room, naming the streetlights visible through the blinds, until I understood that clinging to logic was also a way of staying alive. There were times when I would slip from one edge of sleep into something else, a place where I could still hear the living room clock, but the sound had a second layer, a timbre, like someone breathing through fabric. Once I woke to the sensation of nails pressing along my ankle, a soft, precise pressure like someone tracing a route along my skin. I flinched and held my breath, and the pressure moved up my leg, and I could feel the closeness, like a presence that learned the shape of me. I remember the sound that night, the bedpost making a tiny knocking as if someone were counting off touches with a knuckle. I told my parents the next morning, and they exchanged looks like sailors in a storm, not sure which rope to pull. There is a memory that became almost ritual in itself, and I will describe it because it returns when I close my eyes. It is the image of the armchair which sat in the corner of our living room under the window that looked out to Hemlock Street. It was a heavy, upholstered chair with a pattern of faded roses and a sagging cushion like a toothless mouth. It belonged to the house, by the way. Old furniture belongs to a place. Gray and faintly aromatic with dust and the faint perfume of whatever previous owner had used. One autumn evening, my grandparents came over and left early, and we were cleaning up plates. Lucy was nosing around the yard, and I was alone with the chair and the damp light of evening. The chair had always made me uneasy, but that night it felt like a sentinel watching, like it had been waiting for my attention. When the household quieted down to the hum of the refrigerator and the rain on the eaves, I heard it,
A settling sound, a breath exhaled from an old throat. Then the chair rocked quietly toward the window, and the fabric cracked in a way that sounded almost human. I told my mother, and she laughed and said, "Maybe it wants to look at the rain." But there was a seriousness in her eyes I had not noticed before. The house kept its secrets in common items, and the chair became one of those items. It would become, over months, our armchair that would seem to watch the house like a guardian, that had turned watchful for reasons that were not all good. As a preteen, I started asking questions that were sharper than the ones adults wanted to answer. I asked the landlord, Mrs. Green, about the history of the house. She told me about a family who had lived there in the 1940s, and then about brief renters with transient jobs. She shrugged about the cellar and told me once about a boy who had run away and was found 2 blocks over. "Old houses collect stories like coins," she said. That opened a box of curiosity in me. I began to look through old newspapers at the public library with Mrs. Green's vague anecdote as a seed. I learned the name of the family who had owned the house, a surname that did not match anything else in my life. I took note of one article, a short piece, about a child who had gone missing in the neighborhood in 1952 and the search that followed. None of the facts matched perfectly. I am careful in describing what I suspected then and what I know now, because memory and investigation sift and rub against each other and create new shapes. There were multiple small confrontations with the house that slowly severed trust. One night, the bed covers were drawn off me and cast across the floor like a shroud. Another night, the front door opened on its own when every lock was engaged. A lamp would shatter in the kitchen without a visible cause. The most disturbing incidents began to involve other people. Once, Lucy woke in the middle of the night to the sound of someone whispering her name. She said a voice had called Lucy with a tone that was amused and patient and very close. She turned on the bedside lamp and found a small handprint, pale and cool, on the inside of the window, a print that was not smeared, but a perfect negative, as if a child's palm had pressed just long enough to leave a shape. It could be condensation, Sarah said, but Lucy remembered a smell like books and soap that lingered only when the handprint was fresh. We started to avoid talking about it with neighbors because their faces hardened with the practical expressions of people who had to keep a mortgage and schedules. "You grow out of it," Tom said when we told him. He sounded more afraid of being wrong than of our story. The house became a network of secret signals and rituals to keep it at bay. We used night lights and left televisions on with low volume like a ward. I kept my toy soldier under my pillow and would press his metal helmet against my forehead until the metal was warm with my feverish body. I developed an inner tally of the nights and the episodes like a ledger where I could project control. The more I counted, the less comfortable the adults became. I could feel the way Dr. Patel's eyebrows tightened in the office, and the way Detective Ruiz from the local precinct came by once, and his presence left the house feeling like a jury. He took notes and asked careful questions about patterns and timings, and then later told my parents that, in the absence of hard evidence, people tend to make mistakes. His voice was the kind you hear before doors close. There is one night that changed the axis of the house into something brutal and direct. It was the night of the invasion. I remember the day lead up to it. With ordinary details, the way the mind protects the important with the small. My father was late from work, smells of oil and coffee clinging to his shirt. My mother had been arguing with Mrs. Green over the phone about a late bill, and Lucy had been giggling with Tom over a comic strip. The sky had the thin gray light of late winter, the kind that makes everything look paper-thin and likely to tear. That night I was supposed to fall asleep, but I could not. I lay awake listening to the house breathing. Around midnight there was a sound of something heavy on the stairs, a slow, measured step that did not belong to anyone in the house. The light upstairs flickered. I got out of bed because the sound was closer than before, and when I reached the hallway, I could see that the door to my parents' bedroom was open, a narrow ribbon of light and a shadow like 2 hands folded. I remember the feeling of cold that rose up from the boards, a low pressure that made my ears pop. I called out, "Mom? Dad?" And the voice that came back was softer than I had expected, and it said my name like it was a secret between pages. I stepped forward, and then someone seized my ankle and pulling hard like a rope around my skin. The sensation was precise and terrible, a metal-like cold and a pressure that wanted to slide under my ribs. It did not feel like a human hand. I kicked, and the grip tightened, and then an air moved into the room that tasted like pennies and old paper, and a whisper by my ears said, "We have room." And the house itself felt like it was swallowing me. I cannot describe in purely clinical terms the way the invasion felt. It was tactile and sensorial in a way that left the rational mind staggered. The pressure seemed to move along with intention, exploring the lines of my body like a cartographer studying a coast. I felt something cold sliding beneath my shoulder blade, and a breath on my neck that reeked like a basement. I screamed, and there was the weight of someone sitting on my chest, heavy and immovable. My parents were awake in moments, ripping the covers, turning on lights, and the immediate human clamor was enough to make the presence recede like smoke. I remember my father's hands on my shoulders, the smell of grease oil, and the way his voice cracked when he said, "Get up," as though the words themselves could dislodge it. We called the police. Detective Ruiz was there with a flashlight and folded expression, and he took a report and looked for marks on my skin. There were pale impressions like finger marks, shaped oddly, not quite human. The police took statements, wrote "possible assault unknown force" in their forms, and asked my parents to consider getting the locks changed and to keep alcohol on hand as a means to keep gatherings down in the house, which felt like a small, bewildered joke. The house had found a language that the formal world could not translate. After that night, my parents split into two teams of response and containment. My mother started keeping a thermos by the bed with hot tea and insisted on bedtime prayers that felt like liturgy. My father installed extra lighting and put a cheap security camera in the hallway, something clunky with blinking LED lights that made a small blue star on the ceiling. There was comfort in devices. We rewired the house with alarms and sensors and a new deadbolt on the front door. We brought in a man from a private company who drilled, measured, and explained in technical terms the vulnerabilities in old frames and weak locks. He used words like retrofitting and torque and explained how a strike plate could be reinforced with longer screws to distribute force across a wider load-bearing area. I remember him showing us the metal plates and saying, "If you want real security, you need to strengthen the frame and understand where the loads transfer." The procedure was specific and plausible and gave the adults a project to do. It did not stop the nights. The camera footage, which I later watched in fits and starts over years, showed the hallway empty and then a shimmer near the base of the stairs, a movement like heat rising from tarmac on a hot day. Once the camera recorded the armchair in the living room shifting gently toward the window, though no human hands touched it. The footage was grainy, and the sound was mostly electrical hiss, but in the final moments there is a frame where the image tightens into a pair of eyes above the cushion, small and luminous, and watching. We were told not to rely too heavily on grainy images because the human eye loves to see intention. That did not make the eyes less there. We tried to treat the house like a patient we could cure. In addition to the sleep study and the police reports, we invited a local historian to talk about the property and a clergy member to do a blessing. Reverend Allen came with a box of old prayer cards and said words that smelled of cedar and lemon oil, and he sprinkled water along thresholds. He asked if we had ever found toys or odd objects in walls, and we said no, and then found a small tin soldier wrapped in wax paper beneath the floorboard in my room. It was a child's toy, its paint flaked, with one eye scratched off and a bite mark along its chest. The sight of that toy broke something in me because it was a private evidence. It had been placed there and it had been hidden in plain sight. I could not tell whether I felt relief that we had found something or dread that this was something the house wanted us to know.
Mrs. Green muttered about previous tenants with sentimental tendencies, and my mother tucked it into a drawer. The toy soldier would return later and become the most precise sign the house could send. When I was 15, I made the difficult decision to leave Hemlock Street for a few months. The house had a quality that felt contagious, the way sadness can seem to spread on a bus. I moved in with my aunt for the summer and found sleep with fewer interruptions. I thought distance would dull the thing at the center of the house. For a while, it did. The night seemed like blue water separated by thick glass. But when I came back, there was a small thing on the kitchen windowsill, my toy soldier. The same chipped metal, the same missing eye, but now its chest had new marks, like bite marks, and behind it, a smear on the glass, like a palm. My mother swore she had thrown it away. My sister said she had never left the house alone in that week. The soldier had returned, and that proved to me, in a very human way, that the house had a persistence beyond doors and locks. Around that time, I began to act differently in public. I developed an argumentative streak, perhaps as a defense mechanism, perhaps because my sleep was disturbed and the world looked strange. I lost friends because the story of a house that breathed and moved its furniture is the kind of story that people either believe or use as a test to measure your sanity. Tom stopped coming over because his parents were worried he would be influenced. My father began to sleep in the living room with the television on and a sense of permanence in his exhaustion. Detectives came by less, and then not at all, their time consumed by crime that registers in statistics and insurance claims. I found support sometimes in the most unlikely places. Mr. Harlan next door, an older retired carpenter with a jaw like granite, listened without laughing. He said, "Old timber holds stories, boy. It is always in the joints." And I took that as permission to keep talking. There were moments of extreme tension that I will describe because they are the ones that change the arc of my life. The first of those happened in spring, a sequence that lasted 3 nights and turned the house from an antagonist into a predator. The night began with a simple sound, a slow drag that crept down the hallway. And then the lamp in my room went out, though we had replaced the bulb earlier. I crept from bed, and the floorboards felt slick, as if a film of oil coated my soles. The air smelled sharp, like bleach, and the circular motion of the chair at the top of the stairs suggested patience. I remember standing at the doorway, feeling the stage lights of the outside world cut off by the curtains, and then a hand on my shoulder that was not cold, but dry and papery, and had the smell of old pages. It pushed me into the bed, and the heaviness came down on my chest until I could not breathe. I clawed, my nails tearing the sheets, and in that pressure I heard a whisper in my ear asking, "Why are you here?" The question was both intimate and accusatory. I vomited on the covers from the force of it, and someone or something laughed soft and pleased. After it left, I crawled to the hallway and found scratch marks along the wall, a ruffled seam as if something had pushed through the joint in the plaster. The marks were not deep, but they were precise, like letters of a language I did not know. The second moment came months later, when the house escalated beyond my personal territory and touched someone I loved. My partner Claire had moved in with me after college. We had found a quiet apartment, but I kept returning to Hemlock to clear out the house for sale. She came with me one night to help sort boxes, and when she sat in the armchair, I felt the room tighten. She told me later that the chair had felt as if it was breathing in. She turned to me and said, "I feel watched," and at that moment the lamp behind her clicked off, and a specter of cold slid across her shoulder and left a pale crescent like a fingernail on her arm. She cried out, and I took her hand, and the house seemed to test us both like a judge. She began to have dreams about the kitchen, the sound of metal ringing, and the hands of a child tapping the window. She stopped sleeping in the house altogether and slept on the couch, and I watched the way those nights hollowed her out. The strain took its toll, and we argued about selling the house, or refurnishing it, or calling a priest. This argument and the following events would widen a fissure that would never fully close. The third and final prolonged tension erupted into something we could not simply battlement away. One night, Claire awoke to a pounding at the bedroom door, urgent and rhythmic, and then the sound of something dragging itself up the stairs. I was in the kitchen putting on coffee, and I heard her scream, a slicing, sharp sound that turned the house into an animal. We both ran and found the front door standing open, though the deadbolt had been engaged earlier. There was mud on the threshold that led into a path like footprints made by a small hand. Claire crouched and touched one of the prints and came away with a smear of black under her finger. She smelled like
Smoke and old sugar, and began to cry. As the house surged around us, the living room chair tipped over on its side, and the toy soldier lay in the center of the floor, its head snapped off. At the moment the chair fell, I felt something vast and patient step through the doorway. The air itself shifted, and I understood in that instant that whatever had been concentrated on me when I was a child had been growing in small increments, nourished by denial and fear. In the aftermath, we called in a professional team, a private investigator named Elaine, who specialized in so-called residual phenomena, similar to property history studies and anomalous objects. Elaine was methodical and named things in ways that made them sound like files. She interviewed neighbors, collected oral histories, and retrieved public records. She found a brief note in a courthouse registry, a small mention of a foreclosure, and then a child's name attached to the property. A ledger entry that suggested a death that had been minimized by doctors. We paid for a full sweep, an electromagnetic survey, and a thermal camera pass. The survey revealed cold spots along seams of the house that held lower than ambient temperature, and the thermal images showed voids where warmth should be. Elaine produced a report and explained in clinical terms the possibility of drafts and subterranean voids, and also allowed for a category she called anomalous persistence, which she did not define neatly, but in her eyes, she said, whatever you call it, it leaves traces. She recommended a careful removal and cataloging of objects and to treat them as evidence. One object in particular became a pivot point, a currency of proof: the toy soldier. We found the soldier on the windowsill facing outside, and its paint scraped, not like the wear of time, but like teeth marks. I took it to a private conservator who performed a physical inspection showing microabrasions and traces of organic residue in the paint crevices. The conservator explained a process of swabbing and solvent testing, and we submitted samples to a lab. The lab report was routine, mundane paragraphs about material degradation and organic compounds, but one notation stood out: traces consistent with human saliva and keratin, which implied the soldier had at some point been handled by a living mouth. The notation didn't explain the intention behind the bite marks, but it validated that the object had moved between hands and mouths across different eras. It was enough to bring Detective Ruiz back with a new angle and to encourage the local press to cast an interested glance. The social cost of insisting on the strange was steep. Friends who had been allies stepped away. My father drank more and became a man whose memory of small things frayed. My mother Sarah took to sleeping with the curtains open so that the house could not pretend to hide. Mr. Harlan offered quiet knowledge and sometimes turned up with a thermos and a joke about the old boards. Dr. Patel continued to see me and described how traumatic stress can produce hypervigilance and episodes that mimic nocturnal seizures. "You are inside a feedback loop," she said once, holding a pen, her voice measured. "The more you fear, the more your body prepares." That sentence is true in its way, but it did not account for the peculiarities we cataloged. The footprints, the toy, the video frames with eyes. In this way, my life became a ledger of needing to be believed and the cost of being disbelieved. One night in the late winter that would have been simple were it not for the violence, the house crossed a line. Claire had gone out for the evening, and I stayed behind to work on clearing the attic. The house was quiet. I found myself in the kitchen at 3 a.m, holding the toy soldier in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I was methodical and ritualistic, and perhaps louder with fear than the moment required. The air felt thin. The armchair in the living room was slightly turned toward the door, and the whole house felt like a mouth watching the last guest. I set the soldier on the counter and then heard a sound like the sink filling, though no water ran. I stepped toward the living room, and in the doorway I saw a form, wet and dark, pressed against the glass of the front door. A silhouette with a small head and long arms, and when I turned on the light, it receded like a wave. I did not run. I took out my phone and called Claire, and when she answered, I said, "Come home." And she said, "I am going to stay with my sister." I could hear it in the way she held the line, like she was closing it politely, and then she hung up. I felt a new kind of loneliness, because the violence had seeped into the politics of our lives. The next day I took the soldier and wrapped it in paper and drove to the river and threw it into the current. I wanted to deny the house any physical object it could claim. For a day, I felt like someone who had finally stopped feeding a beast. The relief did not last. 2 weeks later, the soldier was on my desk at work, its metal, headless body lying like a casualty with the same bite marks as before. There are no good answers for how it returned. I did not know if someone had retrieved it, or if the house could transport objects between rooms and then into public spaces. The phenomenon defied tidy explanations. As the house made its demands more obvious, I began to prepare for a confrontation. I read accounts of people who had lived with similar circumstances and archived their methods. I rehearsed dialogues in my head. One evening, I gathered partners, neighbors, and a small team composed of people who had not yet placed a boundary line in concrete. Among them were Tom, who had left his job for online work and who brought a camera set, Mr. Harlan, who offered experience with old wood and a blunt toolkit, and Detective Ruiz, who had become less skeptical and more protective. We planned a confrontation like a small military campaign. Elaine, the investigator, drew diagrams of the house and labeled cold spots and the points where the evidence concentrated. We determined to stay awake and watch with cameras, and with ourselves as a human radar, we would create a ring of people who refused to sleep and who would bear witness. The plan was rational and contained specific tasks and contingencies. We rented a generator to ensure continuous power and placed thermal cameras with infrared sensors in the hallways and in the living room pointed at the armchair. The technique was practical and grounded in procedures, and it felt like taking back territory. The showdown happened on a Saturday. The equipment hummed, and the house became a clinical theater and a trap. The people we recruited were practical. Claire had come back for the night and sat with a flashlight. We split tasks. Tom watched the monitor and kept notes. Mr. Harlan kept a hammer near the door. Detective Ruiz stood like a man who had learned when to speak and when to watch. The night moved like a film, with a long, tense stretch where nothing happened, and then a rupture. Around 2 in the morning, the thermal cameras picked up a cold mass forming near the baseboard under the stairwell. The monitors registered a temperature drop 10 degrees. The cameras showed a ripple like heat sucked away from a candle. Then the armchair began to tilt toward the window, and as it moved, the toy soldier appeared at its feet, reassembled and whole, with its head restored as if no time had passed. Claire screamed, and then there was a sound louder than any before, a noise like 1,000 fingernails tapping a glass, and the house exhaled. I moved forward to the chair and reached to pick up the soldier, and a hand, the texture of dry cloth and cold as river stones, closed on my wrist and squeezed so tight I felt bone under tendon. I had prepared words, public and private vows of not backing down, and in the moment I said them aloud. I called out the names of those I loved and of those who guarded me, Sarah, Mark, Lucy, and I named the small landmarks of my childhood, the freckle on my left arm, the scar from falling off the swing. The grip tightened and then released, as if satisfied by the fact of acknowledgement, as if the presence had wanted to be named. We documented everything, and Detective Ruiz filed a report. The footage made for a wild watch when we rewound, because there are frames the cameras could render and frames they could not. In the footage, the chair moves and the soldier reappears,
and a shadow compresses into a doorway, and there is a timestamp rupture where the image flickers and returns with small blurs. We were left with a collection of evidence that did not fit neatly into court systems or scientific journals, but which was persuasive to some and ridiculous to others. The social consequences persisted. Claire left me a week later, saying she could not live where the night had its own will. My father moved out, my parents divorced. My mother packed photos into boxes and moved to a small apartment with a view of a quiet inner court, and the house on Hemlock Street went on in its own steady way, waiting for the next set of feet to cross the threshold. Years passed, and the house remained unsold for a while, and then it was purchased by developers who gutted the interior. I went back once when the new owners removed walls and found the studs raw and the armchair gone, replaced by a concrete plane and a new light. The piece of the wall where the handprints had once been, repaired so cleanly it seemed as if the scars had never existed. Even then, I felt something like a tremor in my chest, a sense that absence is not the same as departure. The toy soldier surfaced one last time, in a drawer my mother had boxed and stored. She sent it to me in a package with a note saying, "I could not throw this away." I found that even when things are removed, they retain the capacity to haunt memory. The soldier sat on my desk for a long while, like evidence and like a relic. In the months after the most violent episodes, I threw myself into study and into cataloging as a means of making the world manageable. I read case histories and interviewed peritos for a local magazine I wrote for. I sat with psychologists and learned about hyperarousal, about the body's need to protect itself. I educated myself on forensic procedures and kept a small file of reports. In that mundane and painstaking work, I found a form of peace. I learned how to submit evidence to labs and how to document chain of custody. There was a certain procedural satisfaction in placing a seal on a bag with an object inside and noting who had handled it. There is a kind of ritual in the process of making evidence legible to institutions. It does not resolve everything, but it offers a place to stand. I want to pause here to say something to you who are reading, because this story often prompts people to want to respond. If this account moves you, please know you are not alone in feeling unsettled, frightened, or curious. I am asking you to share. One thing for me in the comments. If you have an experience, keep it brief and begin with the words, "when I heard," followed by a short sentence describing the moment. This makes it easier for everyone to read and creates a thread that others can follow. Your note could be as small as a sound you cannot forget, or as large as a break in your life that began with a night. By beginning your comment with, "when I heard," you help others recognize patterns, and you help this community form a map of shared experience. We are a group that learns best by bearing witness. Sometimes your short sentence becomes a theme for future episodes, and it can encourage someone to seek help or to realize they are not alone. I read every comment because each one is a breadcrumb, and because the shared testimony is a kind of collective record. Now continue reading, because what comes next is when the house seemed to decide it wanted more than silence. I want to outline now a technical description of the investigative procedures we used so that anyone skeptical can see how seriously we attempted to apply method. Forensic sampling involved swabbing the object with sterile polyester swabs moistened in saline, then placing the swab tip in a sterile vial labeled with date and time. We logged the chain of custody. Thermal imaging used FLIR cameras calibrated to ambient temperature and placed on tripods with overlapping fields of view. We used an EMF detector to record spikes in electromagnetic activity and synchronized all devices with a timestamp to create a multimodal record. Each procedure aimed to generate independent traces that correlated with anecdotal reports. As the investigations continued, the burden of living with the memory of the house took its toll. There were nights I woke and could still feel the pressure along my ribs. There were days when I would awake with the taste of pennies in my mouth. I learned to live with protective rituals that seemed both childish and necessary. I developed a toolbox of responses to the thing that would not be explained.
I told my story in interviews and on panels, and sometimes I could see the shift in the faces of people when I recited details, the kinds of details that break the polite distance of belief. Some people offered charity and the language of help. Others offered ridicule. The public life of a house that moves its furniture is both loud and strangely isolating. The climax of my fight with the house was not a single cinematic moment that resolves everything. It was instead a complicated sequence of choices, consequences, and final acts. One evening, I decided to return with a small team to the house to perform a ritual that was both practical and symbolic. We scheduled a day of work. We intended to be both closure and confrontation. We would clean out the attic, collect objects, and document everything to leave a record for the future, and then we would seal the space. I assembled a modest crew: Tom, who handled the cameras; Mr. Harlan, who carried experience and a crowbar; Elaine, the investigator who cataloged items; Dr. Patel, who provided clinical oversight and a way to translate fear into language; and Detective Ruiz, who would act as a witness for official record. Claire did not come. She had moved away and had built a life without the house in it. We entered the house with tools and lights and a plan. The attic smelled like beeswax and old fabric bags. We worked under harsh bulbs, and for hours we found the ordinary broken things that houses keep: mismatched socks, a cracked teacup, and then a small trunk with the faded name of a child sewn into the lining. Inside the trunk were notes and a handful of dolls and a scrap of cloth tied like a noose of memory. Elaine cataloged each item and placed it into numbered evidence bags, and Detective Ruiz photographed and took statements. As we worked, the shadows lengthened, and the house settled, and the sense of being watched returned as if to test whether we would tremble. When we reached the living room, the armchair was gone entirely, replaced by an empty square of carpet. The television was unplugged. The toy soldier lay in the center of the rug, whole, with its head intact and its surface bearing fresh dents like teeth marks. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what the house had been practicing for years. It had been preparing us to handle it publicly, and in doing so, it had shown its face. We placed the soldier in a sealed bag and carried it to the car, and then across the street to the municipal archive, where a small team of municipal workers agreed to store it as a historical item for now. The act of laying it on a cataloging table and filling out forms made me shake. The soldier became an artifact, transformed by official attention, and in that moment the house lost something: the absolute control over the object as a symbol. That did not end the phenomenon. The house continued to resist, with small acts of noise, and with windows that stayed fogged long after morning, and with cold spots registered by our instruments. But removing the soldier and putting it into a public place shifted the power balance. The house is clever, and it adapts. The legal and social consequences of our efforts were mixed. There was no criminal conviction because you cannot convict a house. There were whispers in the neighborhood. The house sat empty for a time and then was taken by a developer. Mrs. Green had a health scare and moved away. My parents divorced, and my mother later remarried a man named Robert, who was kind in ordinary ways. I moved cities for work and to separate.
The geography of my youth from my present. The memory of the house, however, remained integral to my sense of self. It had been a teacher in an unethical curriculum, and it left me with a set of survival habits and an interest in questions of testimony and evidence. I started writing, speaking, and collecting stories because the thing that had happened to me was not purely private, and because there are people who live daily with fear that cannot be labeled. Time does something strange to memory. It softens images and hardens facts. When I returned to Hemlock Street years later for the last time, the house was different. A facade, renovated windows, replaced with reflective glass, and behind that, a modern interior with clean lines. The yard was terraced and the porch rebuilt. There was no armchair in the living room, and the walls had been stripped of the grooves we had once hidden in. I wanted to be angry, triumphant even. Instead, I felt a complicated gratitude because some part of me had learned to survive and to speak. We never discovered a motive or a final reason for what the house did. Perhaps there is none. Perhaps it is only property fed by neglect and stories and people. I learned to live with ambiguity. I want to close with an epilogue that tracks time and consequence, because endings are rarely neat, and it is important to know that these things do not conclude immediately. 1 month after we sealed and cataloged what we could, I received a letter from a neighbor who had been out of town. He wrote that his son had been waking up at night saying that someone had been calling his name and that a chair in his own living room had shifted toward the doorway. This suggested the issue had spread into rumor and perhaps had a contagious quality. He asked for suggestions. I replied with practical advice, lighting, cameras, therapy, and the suggestion to document everything. 3 months after the main event, my mother had begun therapy regularly and had a small circle of friends who helped her box and sort. She said that the worst thing was the division it had caused a family and that she missed the sense of home. 6 months later, the house was under new ownership, and a small note in the local paper mentioned renovations and possible subdivision. The toy soldier remained in municipal custody, and occasionally someone would request to see it. Each request felt like a small ritual of memory. The epilogue to such stories is rarely a final silence. Time smooths edges but does not erase dents. If you are hearing this and feeling a pulse of recognition, know that every story has a network. People often ask what practical step helped the most. In our case, the combination of documentation, professional investigation, and the choice to bring the object into the public record mattered. It created a set of validation, witnesses, and shifted the narrative from private fear to shared record. It did not make the nights less strange, but it made the situation less lonely. That is the power of testimony. It demands witnesses, and it demands that we keep telling stories, because silence is often the invitation for repetition. I am not offering vengeance here, only a form of closure. Years later, I learned to accept that some things are part of me now, the way old scars are. I am careful at night. I still prefer a lamp on, though I can sleep with less than I needed when I was a child. I found a kind of peace in turning memory into witness, in filing reports, and in gathering people to look at what we have left behind. We dug up facts and objects and put them into boxes, and sometimes we prayed, and sometimes we laughed. The house changed us into people who pay attention to small sounds. If there is a last lesson I want to leave you with, it is this. Houses hold memory, but they cannot hold the human will to be heard. We were tenacious and small, and we documented and we shouted across the threshold, and that mattered. The final image I keep is not of evil triumphant, but of neighbors standing in the front yard with flashlights and a camera, and an old man with a thermos telling a bad joke to break the tension. In the end, the house remained an object of mystery, but we built around it a human chorus that refused to be silent. If you liked this story and want more accounts like this one, subscribe and share your own brief experience in the comments, beginning with "When I Heard," because your words matter, and because we are mapping a constellation of testimony. Thank you for listening and for keeping watch with me.